Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. In a recent video, I shared from the diary of the man pictured here, Private Stanley Burt Dearborn of the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. It's his story of his life and ranks along the front lines of Petersburg and Richmond in the summer of 1864. As I mentioned in that video, I find it refreshing to read primary source material from a soldier who served in the ranks. It's such a different perspective than the accounts from officers. I want to share more from Dearborn's diary in this passage covering the last 10 days of the Appomattox campaign. So let's dig right in. March 31st. We were shelled by one cannon, an opening in the woods in our front, having been made by the Johnnies to operate it. And one shot landed close to us, striking in a mud puddle and splashing mud over one of our lieutenants. Then, bounding, struck a man of another regiment in our rear, tearing his shoulder and spinning him around. He was led to an ambulance and taken into the woods. The day was spent in making earthworks, bringing up rations from the wagons, cooking, and making corduroy roads for the artillery. April 1st. Lines advanced, streams forded, and corduroy roads laid for the artillery and ammunition wagons. The land is swampy, hard to make progress. We marched in regimental front, halting and reforming now and then. No firing except by cavalry skirmishers in advance. At night, lay in the woods in line until 4 a.m. April 2nd, a signal gun was fired and a general advance followed. On coming out of the woods into a large open field, we encountered 3 lines of abatis made of logs and limbs. Those are obstructions set up by the Confederate defenders. We hurled them back of us in quick time and made a rush for the enemy's line of works in our front. Our cannonading became terrific, every gun in action. But to our surprise, the infantry firing was so heavy on our right by the 6th Corps that the troops in our front, to a certain extent, were withdrawn to reinforce the center on our right. We carried everything on our front, and we jumped down on the inside of the earthworks. A Negro bobbed up and shouted, "General A.P. Hill was killed right there," pointing to the spot. Our brigade wheeled to the right and pressed on toward the forts surrounding the city of Petersburg, where Lee's army was entrenched. We soon struck the South Side Railroad, which ran into the city, mounted the banking, and began firing at close range, perhaps 250 yards, causing the enemy to fall back. A battery in our front was annoying us, and some of our sharpshooters with telescope rifles were ordered to mount the bank and dislodge the battery. They did their work well. In 15 or 20 minutes, they silenced the fire. One of the riflemen who lay next to me remarked as he turned over, "I've picked off 2 men at one of the guns." He got them when they were loading the gun and were for a moment exposed. The next move was to vacate our position, face to the right, and march to a position about 500 yards away on Cox Road, where we lay down in line of battle. In front of us was a large brick mansion, and on a long flight of steps at the rear, facing us, stood the owner making an address to our soldiers. We could not hear what he said. A rebel fort was shelling the locality, but the gunners avoided the house. One of our batteries unlimbered near the mansion, and the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery Regiment, that's Dearborn's men, opened on the fort. Our brigade moved 100 yards to the right and began to dig trenches. My captain ordered us to work for dear life, and we did. He was a 6-footer, and through his field glasses, he watched the enemy. When a puff of smoke was visible at the fort, he shouted, "Down!" and we dropped as if shot and lay till the shot passed. We stopped in this position overnight, and on the 3rd, bright and early, were off on the march to head off Lee, who had quietly disappeared through the night leaving without bidding us farewell. We tramped on the muddy roads until we thought it time to halt for grub, but kept on eating as we walked. There was some skirmishing. We halted at night by the roadside, but built no fires. April 4th, on the road again at 5 a.m. Sheridan's cavalry on the left and had a lively skirmish, intermittent cannonading. We were very short of rations, as our rations and supplies were some miles behind us. Although, during the previous night, they had succeeded in getting to us with part of the rations, enough for one day. Before sunset, we had taken some prisoners who had fallen by the wayside from exhaustion. They had but little meal to make hoe cake and no time to cook it. If we were tired, they were more so, and they were downhearted. Dearborn skips April 5th and jumps to April 6th, the Battle of Sailor's Creek. Morning revealed the enemy close to us. I was detailed for a day on the skirmish line, or as it is now called, the firing line. I certainly had a busy day. The men were tired but plodded on. Bang, bang went the firing all day long. Not artillery, just musketry. And when it got hot, we halted and lay down. Our line of battle was in sight, but did not come under fire. Once I was faint from hunger, and a comrade gave me a pint of cornmeal, which I soaked in water and ate, 3 meals in one, with a small piece of salt pork, raw. Tasted good and put me on my feet, and I caught up soon with the skirmishers. We advanced to a white house near Sailor's Creek, where we had an engagement, and I found some protection behind the house. I called Sergeant Percival's attention to what I thought was a better position near the hen coop, 15 feet distant, but he ordered me to remain where I was. I thought I could get better aim from the other position. I had been hit just before reaching the house and was wounded slightly. Dearborn never says what that injury was, by the way. We had notified the occupants of the house to adjourn to the cellar. Bullets came pattering against it. A shell burst over the color sergeant, one piece splitting the staff. Color Sergeant Mack gathered staff and flag, which had also been torn by a piece of shell as best he could under his arm. Our battle line fought hard but briefly. We had General Ewell's corps in a trap. His killed, wounded, and prisoners amounted to several thousand. A large number of wagons carrying ammunition and all kinds of utensils that an army uses were taken. General Ewell, by the way, that's General Richard Stoddard Ewell, and his staff were among the prisoners. I was on picket duty at night, drew rations at midnight for 3 days. Dearborn's next entries combined for April 7th and 8th. Continued the tramping quite close on the enemy's rear guard. They opened fire with infantry and artillery at one point, but retreated before our line could get into position as we were marching in fours on the road. April 9th. Morning. Found our army in a position that controlled the situation. Surrounded as General Lee was, he must fight or surrender. After his attempt to force back the 24th Corps had failed, he saw that further sacrifice of life was unwise. While waiting for the outcome of the negotiations for surrender, my regiment was lying down, bayonets fixed, and the men were making bets as to when Lee would surrender. But an officer, General George D. Meade, was seen riding down the line, swinging his hat and shouting, "General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia," and pandemonium was let loose. Men were overjoyed. They wept at the prospect of seeing loved ones at home once more, wept for joy. As the captured passed along our front, we asked questions of them. "Ain't you glad the war is over?" "Yes, but I'm darn sorry you whipped us," answered a 16-year-old veteran. These men did not feel like talking to us as they marched homeward to meet those they loved and not seen for years. Many of the boys of the regiment regretted that they did not witness the ceremony. of formal surrender. Rations were wanted just after the surrender. The Confederates were generously provided for during the process of parole, but supplies could not be obtained on account of the mud caused by heavy rain on the 10th. Mules and horses were exhausted. As food did not come, we went for it. Now, there's the account of those 10 days, the last 10 days of the Appomattox campaign by Private Dearborn. I found it to be an informative read, but it did leave me wanting to learn a little bit more about his observation that General George D. Meade rode along the lines cheering. Knowing about Meade's middle name begins with a G for Gordon and not a D, and that he had a reputation as a good and honest, yet a hot tempered man, nicknamed the Old Snapping Turtle. It's hard for me to picture him excitingly spreading the surrender news to the rank and file, to different regiments on the front lines. I looked around in the book a little bit more. This is the regimental history. And I found that one of Dearborn's comrades, Leverett Bradley, provided a more detailed observation of that moment with Meade. And it gave me a bit of perspective. Here's Bradley's version of the surrender news. He wrote, I have never seen such a sight and never expect to, as I did when General Meade rode in from the front and a staff officer announced that Lee had surrendered. The men hurrahed as if their throats would split. Soon after General Meade came riding through the lines, all the flags were given to the breeze, and the men crowded around them and cheered lustily, rushing after General Meade all the time. Men threw up their caps, haversacks, and canteens, and some even took off their shoes and threw them up, running a great risk of never seeing them again. Everyone had a smile on his face, although they had been without rations for a day and a half. Based on Bradley's account, I suspect the staff officer he mentioned is actually the general's son. George Gordon Meade Jr. served his father as an aide de camp. Now, this explanation doesn't account for the middle initial discrepancy, which may simply be an error by Dearborn or the printer. So there you have the recollections from the diary written by Private Dearborn of the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.